This is our development policy seminar, but it's an unusual one because there are two divisions involved here in DESA. There are two great speakers, and Minister Jose Antonio Ocampo has a bunch of laurels to his name, but for us, his most important and most significant appellation is that he's our former US chief and dearly beloved among all of us. So, sir, welcome again. And it's always great to hear that from a career in DESA, you can get on to become minister. So I hold that up as a shining example to everyone. And we're also extremely privileged to have Professor Louis-Philippe Rochon here. He's from the La Rochelle University, and he will be presenting on alternatives to monetary austerity.
And now we have the honor to open a presentation of our lead speaker today. His name is Louis-Philippe Rochon. He is a professor in the Laurentis University, and he's also the editor of Go, one of the biggest heterodox journals. And he has come today to talk to us about alternatives and innovative ideas and create some conversation and discussion. So we have so.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be here. I used to live in New York 30 years ago for my PhD at the New School. I'm happy to see some New School students here. My old roommate from those years, Shadow's sister, and to my students back in Canada who are watching online. So today, I'm very happy because a lot of the same arguments I am making today that you just made that appear in your annual report. And my comments today will be very critical. It's a New School tradition, and I hope that perhaps I'll be extra critical just for the sake of maybe starting a conversation. So, oops. Oh. Okay, good. So just for a quick comment. So I've been working on monetary policy and central banking, and we started this Monetary Policy Institute with Silvio Chiappes, and we're currently editing a series of books, and many of them have come out, and there are some that will be coming out in the coming year. The impact of central banking on gender, for example, which is a great topic for this audience, but others on income distribution as well, the environment, social responsibility, and democracy. Next slide. Am I controlling this or I'm not sure? Okay. And part of the activities, we do a blog, and there's a number of symposiums that will be coming out in the Review of Political Economy, my journal. And some activities. One is on monetary policy and income distribution with the Bank of Italy. That's going to be in the end of March, and you're going to be there. And two symposiums on monetary policy and functional income distribution, and a symposium on conflict and inflation. I'm writing the paper with Ettore Gallo from Italy on that as well. Some of these themes will be coming back. Next slide, please. So this is inflation. Yeah, we all know what's been going up. It's sort of a worldwide phenomenon. And, you know, if we go to the next slide, this rate bump may appear to be somewhat dramatic, but from a historical perspective, it's not as bad as, of course, the 1980s, and it's been inflation been relatively quiet for the past 3 or 4 decades. It hasn't been much of a problem. I can share some thoughts at the end about why that is, but certainly it's a problem now. Next slide. But strangely enough, Americans, according to Gallup, don't see inflation as a major problem. Only 17% in March 2023, sorry, it should be January 2023, only 18% of Americans rank it as an important problem. Second to problems about the big scary state. Martin Wolf called it the inflation genie that has got out of the lamp. And I think that there's sort of a disconnect between what we read in newspapers about inflation and what Americans seem to think about the problem of inflation. And that I'll have a lot to say about at the end. But if I've looked at some of the press, newspaper clippings about inflation, and these are from sort of left of center critical journalists who called it the inflation monster, who called it extreme inflation. I think that this rhetoric in the press hasn't helped this idea that we are living in really difficult inflation. Next, please. So for me, there seems to be sort of an inflation paranoia, and I wonder where this comes from. Like you mentioned, central banks, it is about credibility. If you remember last year, central banks around the world were saying that inflation is temporary and not that much of a concern. They only started raising interest rates once they were criticized as being uncredible, of potentially losing credibility. And that's when interest rates started to come up, to go up. Now, there are always winners and losers in monetary policy, and at the end we'll see about who those winners and losers are, irrespective of whether interest rates are very low or very high. But I think central banks have a communication problem. On the one hand, they say they are fighting inflation because we can't seem to, working Americans can't seem to make ends meet. It's a problem paying our bills. And they're fighting inflation on our behalf. This is the rhetoric that I've looked at for many central banks. It's about consumption, it's about a lot of consumption, about helping working people. Yet, the model on which inflation monetary policy is based upon is the Phillips curve, like it was mentioned, and here central banks are prepared to create a lot of unemployment in order to fight inflation. So on the one hand, they fight inflation to help working Americans, but on the other hand, they're prepared to create a lot of unemployment. Next slide, please. Now, one other reason that they give, more sort of a theoretical reason, is that low inflation, low and stable inflation, is better for economic growth, for planning investments, etc. But and the other issue is that they are afraid of the anchoring of inflation expectations. They're afraid that if workers were demanding higher wages, this would lead to some sort of wage price spiral, and inflation would be long-lasting and destabilizing. But on inflationary expectations, a very recent paper. Now, through this talk, I'm not going to be citing these silly left-wing critical economists. I'll be citing some, serious economists, like from the Federal Reserve. In a recent paper in the Review of Keynesian Economics, who has argued that inflationary expectations play no role. Now, for the record, inflationary expectations, even if you do follow that, that data is coming down. It's coming down. But even then, it doesn't seem to play a very critical role in inflation. Next slide. But see, another serious economist, unlike myself, Federal Reserve, clear that inflationary expectations are not playing a role, that in fact wages are not playing wage increases, wage demands are not playing the role that they played in the 1970s. I'm not sure that was also the case, but anyways, so there you go. Yeah, that's fine. Moreover, there's been a lot of empirical evidence, especially as Bruno and Easterly came up, that has argued that economies can certainly live with inflation. It is not destabilizing until it gets to around 25 and 30%. This is where we get destabilizing effects of high inflation. But certainly at 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9%, inflation is not destabilizing. And even Dornbush and Fisher have argued the same thing. So there seems to be today an inflation hysteria. And for me, I'm very interested in knowing why. First of all, I think it's the effect of financial markets or financial players, the issue of credibility. And in that, if you take a step back, well, inflation decreases the real value of wealth. So here we have a political economy approach to why people are taking inflation seriously. Next, please. Next. So going back to 1974, James Tobin was arguing that hysteria about inflation may lead to policies that keep economic progress well below its potential. And also Stiglitz, just last week, or a few weeks ago, are saying essentially the same thing. It can lead to far-reaching problems of their own. This is something I've called in the paper the weaponization of inflation. So, please, next slide. So let's talk about monetary austerity. Same role as fiscal austerity, but in terms of central bank policy. Inflation peaked in early 2022, mid-2022, and has been coming down ever since. And the question is this the result of monetary policy? And central banks, if you go and you read various speeches of central bankers, many of them are quick to take credit and say, you see inflation is coming down now, well, because we've had these high interest rates. So good for us, and that's the reason that we're going to stay with our policies. There's now talk about immaculate disinflation. This is have you heard that term? And so this is the idea that inflation comes down without any impact on labor markets. But saying that inflation can come down without impact on labor markets is not the same as saying inflation is coming down without any impact on workers, which is something that I'll touch on at the end. But, you know, the whole question is, why is inflation coming down now? And going back to the inflation of even the 1980s, Alan Weiner said it wasn't the result of monetary policy. It was a result of special factors. He was talking about oil markets. He was talking about all those things. Okay? And second of all, just recently, the European Central Bank has come out and said, for every 100 basis point increase in interest rates, it only affects inflation at 0.1%. So very negligible correlation, causality rather, between interest rates and inflation. Next slide, please. But this hasn't stopped the Federal Reserve of having the most aggressive interest rate policy in history. In fact, if you can see here, interest rates have gone up just as high, or at least faster, as this story isn't done yet, but certainly faster than any other previous sort of central bank policy against inflation. Okay, it has taken, 10 months, whereas, what year is that? 2004 took 2 years to get it done. So it's a very aggressive monetary policy. Next, please. So why is inflation coming down? There's 3 possible sources of inflation: demand pull, cost push, and conflict inflation. So these last 2 are sort of the same thing, certainly can be bundled together, but I like to sort of take them apart, sort of to see more of a classical approach to inflation. And I think it puts things in better perspective. Next slide, please. The demand pull inflation, this is what we're typical textbooks story that we tell students. Too much money chasing too few goods. Friedman inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Today, the causes are Biden's fiscal stimulus, too generous, led to excess demand, led to inflation. Federal Reserve's accommodating interest rates were too low for too long, and that led to an explosion in average demand activity, and that led to inflation. And finally, pent-up pandemic savings related to fiscal stimulus, but you gave people a lot of money, they couldn't spend it. Once the pandemic was over, they rushed out and they spent money pushing prices up. Summers, I said I was going to quote only respectable economists, but I'm making an exception. The least, no, go back, please. The least responsible fiscal macroeconomic policy we've had for the last 40 years. And I say this about Summers because he has been pushing for higher rates, more aggressive monetary policy. And I think that is irresponsible. But for other economists, it quickly became plain that the conventional wisdom that roots the inflationary upsurge in the biennial stimulus is misplaced. And Stiglitz has come out and said, there's not a large portion of inflation is demand driven. So if it's not demand driven, now you got to understand that monetary policy works for demand driven inflation. You've got to push those interest rates up to slow down economic activity, and that slows down inflation. If inflation is not demand driven, that poses a problem for monetary policy. Okay? Next slide, please. And so, this is the current policy. It's based on the Phillips curve. Here's a couple of quotes from central bankers that say, the Phillips curve is the theoretical argument on which central bank demand-driven inflation policy relies on. Next slide, please. The problem with the Phillips curve is, generally it has collapsed. This traditional inverse relationship between prices and unemployment doesn't hold anymore. In other words, the Phillips curve is pretty flat. Janet Yellen has said this, Claudio Borio said this, Solo, a lot of other people. So, which means that if you have a flat portion of that Phillips curve, you have to raise interest rates incredibly high in order to push unemployment so high in order to have that impact on inflation. So you have to exploit that flat portion of the Phillips curve. And that requires very high interest rates. And so you have high interest rates, higher interest rates. They don't have impact on inflation. You push them up again because you're just sliding along that flat component of the curve. Next one, please. But central bankers can't give up this model. They don't know what to replace it with. We know that interest rates may affect real estate. We know that, but apart from that, it's sort of a black hole of monetary policy. And in the end, the central banker has no claws. Okay? Next slide, please. Yeah, so speaking on this trade-off with unemployment, you know, Paul Volcker, the standard of living of the average American has to decline. So this is putting the blame on inflation squarely at the feet of workers. If we have inflation, it's because workers are demanding higher wages. It's sort of this price cost inflation. Higher interest rates will also bring some pain to households. Remember that quote from a few months ago. Jason further, we have to tolerate more unemployment. So for me, this is an unacceptable approach to fighting inflation. Next. Now, going back to the 2% target, you mentioned in your annual report the Blanchard paper where they say, you know, maybe 3 and 4%, 2% doesn't have any really big benefits relative to a target of 3 or 4. Well, I go a step further. There's actually no empirical support for a 2% target. And I went back to the Central Bank of New Zealand to look at their studies for 10 years leading up to that decision. I could not find anything at the Central Bank of New Zealand to justify a 2% target. I've read one place that maybe the 2% had to do with this massive fiscal target of 2%, but that's all about it. They just, but there doesn't seem to be, and this is Benjamin Friedman, who's saying that it's a professional embarrassment, the idea that there's no empirical support for 2%. Next slide, please. Cost-push inflation. So this is where I think inflation is coming from. And in that respect, there's been 3 sources mainly associated with higher prices, inflation today, oil and gas, pandemic-related bottlenecks, and profit margins. Now remember, I said at the beginning that inflation has been coming down. And that's been coming down, I think, because of oil and pandemic-related bottlenecks have also sort of resolving themselves. Next one, please. So this is the price of oil. It's back to, you know, close to pre-pandemic levels. So that is certainly one source of cost inflation that's resolving itself. Next slide, please. Here we have the supply bottlenecks are coming down, and with them we've had a dramatic decrease also in the cost of shipping and transporting goods. So, so these are sort of problems about inflation that are coming down, and that's what we've seen. It's not an immaculate disinflation, but rather these sources of inflation are coming down. Next one. It remains one of them. One of them is still this profit margin. We call it profit inflation. Josh Bivens here in the United States has made, was I think the first to make this argument. David McDonald from the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives. And here you have sort of profit margins, profit per unit of real gross value going up in time. And you can certainly see, anyways, it's been a steady climb, but certainly up to higher levels here. And the next one is more interesting here. This is from David McDonald, where he shows the profits of corporations sort of exploding, starting in first quarter of 2021. And then gradually diminishing and seeing inflation coming down. Next slide, please. So the conclusion so far is that inflation is coming down unrelated to central bank policy, and this is not, I'll have to say by inaccurate disinflation. The next one, please. So, no, before that, undoubtedly interest rates were too low for too long. I do think that interest rates, central banks anywhere can have any rate of interest it wants, although there will be consequences. Yeah, Brazil could have an interest rate of 1% tomorrow, but there'll be consequences to exchange rates and all that. It's little, something to point out nevertheless. But low interest rates have had a massive influence on wealth creation. And this is, one of the winners of low interest rates. What should the proper level of interest rates be today? That's a difficult question for another day. But I want to touch on one thing, Gibson's paradox. So this is an argument in the literature that says that higher interest rates lead to higher costs of borrowing. And if firms are trying to protect their profit margins, will pass these costs on to households and consumers. So this argument goes back to Thomas Tooke, next one please, and even to John Kenneth Galbraith in The Affluent Society, and to John Maynard Keynes, of course, who said that Gibson's paradox is one of the most completely established empirical facts within the whole field of quantitative economics. And it's an idea that it's difficult because the next slide will make it more obvious. You see this correlation between the two variables. They're moving together for sure, but which one causes which is more difficult. And I've seen empirical evidence that shows both. But assuming that interest rates, higher interest rates, you see here prices going up before interest rates. So if higher interest rates do lead to higher prices and inflation, this is something that could explain why current monetary policy has contributed to inflation, not lowered it. Next one, please. Finally, I'm not going to say much because I'm running out of time on conflict inflation. So for me, not money, but inflation is always an everywhere conflict phenomenon. So it's always about conflict between social classes. But here I want to say that we've always seen conflict inflation as being between being initiated by workers demanding higher wages. When really, I think workers are simply catching up in order to preserve their real income. And I think that in an increased financialized world, we need to perhaps consider not just wage price inflation, but also profit price inflation as possibly a source of conflict as well. So in the end, there are other ways. If inflation really is the result of costs of supply sides, monetary policy is not well equipped to deal with that. And that what we really need is to turn to fiscal policy. And that could be either price controls, that could be higher taxes on higher profits, that could be really, there's a panoply, I think that's the first time I've used the word panoply. There's a series of policies that we can think about to better address the sources of current inflation. I think monetary policy is a blunt instrument that has very little impact on inflation unless you raise it so incredibly high that you finally collapse your economy. So what is interest rates? I think it's an income distributive variable. This goes back to the work of the great economist that we lost a few weeks ago, Luigi Pazinetti. And Silvio and I have been working on this for a few years now. We should, if that's the case, higher interest rates lead to higher income flows for bondholders. So you have to see interest rates not just as a cost but also as a source of income for a certain class. Finally, so this is just sort of the ways monetary policy can impact both functional distribution of income and also personal income distribution and wealth distribution. Okay. Last slide, I think. Yes. So I agree on the inherent biases of monetary policy. I think that within interest rates, higher interest rates, there'll be a class bias in the sense that it does pit rentiers against, let's say, workers. For example, that it does represent higher income flows to rentiers. There's a gender bias. That's a book that's coming out this year where higher interest rates disproportionately affect industries where there's more women, so there's a gender bias. And there's also a climate bias where low interest rates have an impact on carbon, higher impact on carbon intensive resources. So that's it, I think. Oh. Yeah, so yes, some thoughts on immaculate disinflation. So the idea is that interest rates go up, it doesn't have an impact on unemployment. Inflation is coming down, interest rates are going up, no impact on unemployment. But it doesn't mean that you don't have an impact on the workers. And the last slide will show you the impact of interest rates on personal debt levels. So personal debt ratio of personal income has dramatically gone up since 2021. So immaculate consumption, we got to redefine it in a very broad term to include just workers, not just unemployment. Thank you very much.